We live in an astonishing time. In just the last century, we've learned that the world is full of quantum particles that can be in two places at once, harnessed nuclear fusion to create the most powerful bombs ever, and figured out how to sequence the 3 billion letters of human DNA. But one thing we haven't been able to do is explain how the brain produces consciousness. In this video, I'll describe what scientists have learned about the puzzles of the mind from studying everything from the flickering light of stars to the movements of your own neurons. And along the way, I'll reveal why I believe that one day, we'll be able to download consciousness into a computer, and what that might sound like. Scientists have known for a long time that our conscious experience arises from the activity of neurons in the brain. Specifically, it happens in this gray matter up here called the cerebral cortex, which is what makes us human. This part of the brain has about 86 billion neurons, each capable of forming thousands of connections with other neurons. Those connections allow neurons to communicate with each other by sending signals down their axons, which are like wires. When those signals reach the end of an axon, they're received by another neuron through these branches called dendrites. For decades, neuroscientists thought that consciousness would be found in the connections between neurons. After all, if we can understand how individual neurons work, then surely understanding how they're connected will tell us how they give rise to us. But researchers have been disappointed time and again. In the 1980s, they tried to map the connections between the neurons in a monkey's visual cortex and discovered that there weren't enough connections to support the number of cells in the cortex. Since then, scientists have found the same thing over and over again. No matter how they sliced monkey brains or even human brains taken during epilepsy surgery, they saw more connections than they could account for. But recently, some researchers have come to the conclusion that it's not connections that are important, but rather what happens inside the neuron. They've focused on something called the membrane potential, which is the electrical difference between the inside and outside of a neuron. When a neuron is at rest, its membrane potential is -70 millivolts. That means that the inside of the neuron is 70 millivolts less charged, or more negative, than the outside. When a neuron receives a signal, ions of charge flow through channels in the neuron's membrane to bring the inside of the cell closer to 0 millivolts. When the potential reaches a certain threshold, say -55 millivolts, the neuron fires. A pulse of electricity rushes through the neuron, down its axon, and across the synapse to the next neuron, where the process starts again. But in the past decade, scientists have realized that it's not just the membrane potential that matters, but also the neuron's internal structure. Neurons are filled with all sorts of different proteins and other molecules that respond differently to changes in the membrane potential. Some activate when the membrane potential swings past a certain threshold, while others deactivate. Those molecular switches turn on or off the genes that control what the neuron does. For example, they control whether the neuron should grow new dendrites or axons to connect with other neurons. Some scientists think that consciousness might arise from the specific pattern of molecular switches inside a neuron. This idea seems crazy, but it's starting to make sense when we consider that a single human neuron can receive 200,000 inputs at once and integrate them into a coherent whole. It's possible that consciousness arises from the unique pattern of molecular switches inside a neuron, or it could come from the patterns of neural activity across large groups of neurons. Either way, we're getting closer to unraveling the mystery of consciousness because we're beginning to understand the basic unit of life, the neuron. In fact, by studying the flicker of light from distant stars, we've gained insight into how our brains deal with noisy inputs. Our universe is a noisy place. There's radioactive decay, thermal motion, the crash of asteroids. All that noise creates random variations that scientists call shot noise. Shot noise affects everything, including the signals sent by neurons. Shot noise is a problem because it can mask the real signal we're interested in. Imagine you're trying to listen to a radio, and there's so much static that you can't make out the song. In both cases, you need to separate the signal from the noise. Neurons do this in an interesting way. They convert the input signal into a burst of activity and pass that along their axons. Then they take the signal back at the other end of the synapse and reconstruct it. But the process of converting signals into bursts and then reconstructing them introduces even more noise. Researchers at the Salk Institute in California wanted to figure out how the brain separates meaningful signals from the noise. To answer that question, they turned to data collected by NASA's Chandra X-ray Observatory. They studied the light from 2342 galaxies, which flickers because the light takes time to travel to Earth. During that journey, it bounces off gas clouds and gets absorbed or scattered, adding extra noise. The scientists developed a model that simulates how light travels from distant galaxies to our telescopes, and then they added in shot noise. Then they used machine learning algorithms to separate the meaningful signal from the noise. And they discovered something interesting. The algorithm naturally grouped together bright points of light, even though that wasn't part of the model. Turns out the brain doesn't need to search for signals. It can just group together things that happen close together in space and time. The finding helps explain how we see faces in crowds, find objects against a noisy background, and pay attention to relevant details in our lives. And in a similar vein, by recording the activity of hundreds of neurons in the visual cortex of a monkey while showing them random images, researchers have decoded how the brain responds to the gist of an image without getting bogged down in the details. Their findings suggest that the brain uses a hierarchical system to analyze visual information. First, neurons respond to simple features such as edges and orientations. Then they send their signals to other neurons, which combine the simple features into more complex ones. Eventually, the brain constructs a representation of the gist of the image without bothering to analyze every little detail. These findings are helping researchers develop better artificial intelligence systems that mimic the way the brain processes information. But to really understand consciousness, we need to know how the brain deals with another kind of noise, internal noise. That's because neurons don't always fire when they should. Neuroscientists studying epilepsy have recorded the activity of neurons in the human brain. They found that some neurons, particularly those involved in higher cognitive functions, aren't very reliable. Some of them only fire correctly 60% of the time. That unreliability raises a big question. How does the brain deal with neurons that misfire? To answer it, researchers turn to fruit FLIs. FLIs have about 100,000 neurons, which is small enough that scientists can record the activity of nearly all of them at once. Researchers genetically modified the FLIs so that some of their neurons misfired randomly. Then they put the FLIs through a maze and found that the FLIs' behavior was normal, despite their misfiring neurons. That suggests that the brain can correct for noisy neurons. But how? By recording the activity of individual neurons. Researchers found the answer. When a neuron misfires, other neurons adjust their activity to compensate. Those compensatory signals spread quickly through the network of neurons, suppressing the misfire within 5 milliseconds. Turns out that the brain can correct for noisy neurons by using the very connections that give rise to consciousness. Now, we're still a long way from figuring out consciousness, but recent findings like these are helping scientists piece together how the brain converts raw signals into conscious experience. Ultimately, I think we'll be able to download consciousness into a computer. We just need to figure out what it's made of. If you like this video, please subscribe so you don't miss out on future episodes. Thanks for watching.